Institute. He was granted a number of scholarships in foreign universities, including the Palacký University in Czech Republic and Fulbright scholarship in Moscow. And what might be most interesting from our today's perspective, Stephen also served as a visiting professor at Jagiellonian University during previous academic year, also thanks to the Fulbright scholarship. He also authored a number of notable publications, including such books as The New Politics of Sex, The Sexual Revolution and Civil Liberty, and Taken into Custody, The War Against Fathers, Marriage and the Family. The first book is going to be published soon. He will speak about conservative misconceptions about marriage and why it matters.
Thank you, Dr. Zeke, and thank you for the organizers of the conference as well for this invitation to speak here today. I want to engage in a little exercise to maybe wake you up in thinking outside the box of political correctness. I'm not in the habit of preaching to the choir. I will be blunt. I will say things you probably won't want to hear. But I think it's very clear, if you look at the Western world, at least today, that the battle for marriage is being lost. There's no question about this. It's been going for years. It's been predicted for years by a number of people. And I think, moreover, that I hear a lot of cliches and a lot of platitudes and a lot of nonsense, frankly, spoken by both sides. So I think I want to talk about some of this today and maybe shake up and help you to think about this in ways that maybe you haven't thought about it before. I think we've been dealing with a very superficial understanding of what marriage is and what is threatening marriage. We are trying to save marriage, I think, on the cheap, without considering the dynamics and the problems that created this crisis in the first place. I want to state some very direct and clear truths, I think, about marriage and the political order, which I think must be heard. If the marriage and the civil order is to survive. The eyes of the world today are on Poland on these issues. And I think it's up to Poland and the rest of Central and Eastern Europe to, it's going to be here that these issues are decided. The main cliche we hear a lot these days is that the same-sex marriage is unacceptable because the purpose of marriage is procreation and raising children, but that's not quite right. Tens of millions of single mothers show very clearly that the purpose of procreation, procreation is quite possible without marriage. This platitude is easily refuted by the homosexualists who simply point out the fruitlessness of many heterosexual marriages. The purpose of marriage is not procreation. The purpose of marriage is fatherhood. Marriage allows children to have fathers. Once this is understood, everything about marriage falls into place. Once this is recognized, gender-neutral marriage makes no sense. And the opponents of marriage cannot have any answer to this, because even fruitless marriages can adopt, and the children will still have a father. This reveals same-sex marriage as an obvious absurdity, and an obvious attack on civilization's most basic institution by radical ideologues who targeted fatherhood before they targeted marriage. But also, once this is understood, the way to save marriage becomes very clear and very feasible. Marriage is not a gender-neutral institution. It is not a gender-symmetrical institution. Motherhood and fatherhood are not symmetrical. Motherhood is a biological fact. Margaret Mead, of all people, pointed this out. Motherhood is a biological fact. Fatherhood is socially constructed. We heard about social construction yesterday. This is the difference. The principal institution for constructing fatherhood is marriage. Marriage turns a man from a sperm donor into a father, and allows the man to exercise the same authority over children that the mother would otherwise exercise. Instead of recognizing this truth, conservatives labor this cliche that marriage exists to protect, to control men's promiscuity. Well, maybe it does, in part, but the larger purpose is to protect the father-child bond. And this is the most powerful point in the case. It's the presence of the father that creates both the intact family and the civil institution. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes said this very clearly, very succinctly in his book. He said, in the state of nature, the dominion is in the mother. For in the state of nature, I'm quoting Hobbes, where there are no matrimonial laws, it cannot be known who the father is unless it be declared by the mother. And therefore the right of dominion of the child dependeth on her and is consequently hers. Okay? Only in the state of civil society where matrimonial laws do exist is authority over the children shared with the father. Okay? This is probably the only essential role of marriage, of the state in marriage, is to protect the parent-child bond, especially the father-child bond. But both parents, really. This was the basis of Lord Mansfield's rule, also in the Code Napoleon, which said that a child born in a marriage is presumed to be that of the mother's husband, okay? Presumed to be that of the husband. This allowed a marriage to survive the wife's adultery, because earlier ages, I think, had a little bit more balanced view of the male and female tendencies toward promiscuity. The role of marriage, above all today, is seen very starkly in the epidemic that we see throughout the world, throughout the Western world especially, of fatherlessness. We also see motherlessness, but fatherlessness always begins the process. The father is the weakest link in the family bond, and without an effort to secure him to the family, you end up with this epidemic of fatherlessness. This is too obvious to need elaboration. You look at the American inner cities, the Native American reservations, the north of England, the banlieue of Paris and Marseille, much of Africa, you're looking at impoverished, crime-ridden, drug-infested matriarchies. And increasingly today, affluent communities in the middle classes are following suit. Moreover, virtually every social pathology today, violent crime, substance abuse, you name it, you ask any policeman, every social pathology today is directly connected with fatherlessness. Not race, not poverty, fatherlessness. And I think you could argue in the banlieue of Paris and other cities in Europe today, I think you could find a similar link with terrorism, because the same communities are largely fatherless communities. Okay, there are several practical consequences of this. One is obviously the dysfunctional nature of same-sex marriage. Judge Vaughn's statement in the California Proposition 8 case that gender no longer forms an essential part of marriage is, of course, preposterous. Marriage exists to reconcile the most basic difference between the sexes. That one sex has an indisputable biological connection with her offspring, whereas the other sex must have his connection with the offspring created by legal guarantee and social convention. This is why the late Phyllis Schlafly said that, quote, the trend toward non-marriage and toward same-sex marriage is a direct attack on fathers. Okay, marriage between two men or two women simply mocks the purpose of marriage. A presumption of parenthood confirms parental status on any individual or individuals who are recognized as married. Maggie Gallagher, who couldn't be with us today, calls this the problem of too many parents. Right? A California law that would allow children to have more than two parents makes this very clear. As according to Phyllis Schlafly, the primary purpose was to allow lesbians, or any single mothers, to marry and interfere, as she said, with the rights of fathers. Okay? So I'll return to this point. Homosexual parenting, same-sex marriage, homosexual parenting, I should say, marginalizes biological fathers and mothers even further from their offspring, since obviously at least one homosexual parent has to acquire their children from somewhere else. Where do they acquire that children? From divorce, of course, or from cohabitation. And this is one reason why I won't go into this now, why one connection between divorce, cohabitation on the one hand, and same-sex marriage on the other. But if there are implications to this, my point, that the enemies of marriage do not wish to acknowledge, there are also implications that the friends of marriage, that is to say, you, all of us, have trouble facing. And I want to, the important point, first of all, is that homosexuals did not destroy marriage. Heterosexuals did. As Mike McManus of Marriage Savers writes, divorce is a far more grievous blow to marriage than today's challenge by gays. You could say the same thing about cohabitation. This is only one reason. There are many reasons. This is one reason why same-sex marriage cannot be addressed without confronting the larger issues like divorce and cohabitation. One is that same-sex marriage would not even exist today. It would not be an issue today if it were not for divorce. The Economist says, the Economist points this out, many people point this out, that the weakening of marriage has been the heterosexuals doing, not the homosexuals doing. This is a powerful argument. Jonathan Rauch says the same thing. Now, these advocates who say this conveniently forget that the social damage that has been wrought has been wrought by their allies, and that the divorce laws were also written by the same people who are now pushing same-sex marriage. Okay, so but the point is the same. It's still a very legitimate point. As Froma Harrop says, people who won't censure divorce carry no special weight as defenders of marriage. Okay, now, opponents of same-sex marriage, advocates of same-sex marriage have exploited this myopia, but the implications cut both ways. The other implication of this point is that it's only because of the deterioration of marriage that homosexuals want marriage in the first place. In other words, I can show you quotes from Andrew Sullivan, from Stephanie Kuntz, and other advocates of same-sex marriage who say, if you want to go back to monogamous marriage of the 1950s, where marriage is a lifelong binding contract, go ahead, and we will stay out of it. It's only because you have destroyed marriage, you have degenerated marriage with divorce and cohabitation that we find it attractive, okay? So the homosexuals admit, this point came up earlier, homosexuals admit that they only are interested in marriage because it has been debased by heterosexuals. Okay, so that argument cuts both ways. I can give you the quotations if you're interested. So just similarly, we can look today at divorce as a system of largely destroying fatherhood. It's no accident that divorce court has become largely a method of plundering and criminalizing fathers. Our prisons today are filled not only with fatherless children, they're also being filled with childless fathers. Okay, so it's both generations. This is another reason. Helen Smith has written a very good book called Men on Strike. She argues that men are today engaged in a de facto marriage strike, that men are refusing to marry and have children, or in or out of marriage, because of the way that they are treated in the divorce courts. The knowledge that they can have their children taken away, their homes taken away, their income taken away, and they can be jailed without trial. Okay, and this has created a marriage strike. Helen Smith, Men on Strike. And yet we hear nothing about this from the conservative groups in the Western world. Okay? And this is the mistake that you must not make in Poland. Okay? Instead, the conservative groups jump on the bandwagon, and they actually endorse dishonest measures to punish what's called domestic violence, child abuse, and the child support Gestapo that, in the words of Jed Abraham, the author and an attorney, forces a father to pay for the filching of his own children. Interestingly, too, the authoritarian measures that are put in place in the divorce courts are now being used by same-sex marriage advocates to justify, to rationalize similar repressive measures against the opponents of same-sex marriage. Jill Josephson, a political scientist and feminist, argues that the authoritarianism of no-fault divorce and the child support system justify stopping the mouths of those who oppose same-sex marriage. So once you've taken away people's children and thrown them in prison without trial, stopping their mouths over same-sex marriage is pretty easy to rationalize and justify. In fact, you can make an argument that many other measures that I'm sure you're aware of are also modeled on the Anglo-American system of divorce. For example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is the language in that convention which undermines the rights of both parents, mothers and fathers, even in intact families, is modeled on the Anglo-American divorce laws. I can explain how if you're interested in that. The Equal Treatment Directive, which I know concerns many people in this room, the Equal Treatment Directive is based on Anglo-American divorce law in many respects. It's vague, it's subjective, it's based on feelings, and I could give you many others. In other words, the same measures that the feminists and divorce advocates have used on fathers in the past are now being used against Christians and others who complain about, who object to same-sex marriage. Okay? What is being overlooked in all of this is the role of the state in marriage. The radicals, the sexual radicals, demand, in the words, I'm quoting here from their manifesto, beyond same-sex marriage. What they're asking for is government recognition and legal recognition of not only same-sex marriage, but a wide range of relationships, households, and families regardless of kinship or conjugal status. The state must recognize these relationships. Now the question has come up before, why? Why does the state have to recognize this? Nothing's stopping 2 people, 5 people from walking into a church or an auditorium, having a ceremony, calling it a marriage, going off and living together and calling it a marriage. What's all the fuss about? Nothing's stopping them from doing that. Why does the state have to recognize it? Well, the answer, very simple, is welfare benefits. Welfare, state benefits. Benefits, goodies conferred by the state, which kick in, which begin to operate, in many cases, only in the absence of the father, especially in the United States. Not here in Europe so much yet, but in the absence of the father. When fathers provide, again, I said the father-child bond is the basic unit of reason for marriage. When fathers provide for their own children, each household is financially viable and self-sufficient and autonomous from the state. The involvement of the state in the family is not necessary when each father is allowed and required to provide for his own children. But expanding the state recognition to these other configurations, these other relationships, inverts that principle diametrically. Suddenly, the family is not independent of the state. The family is dependent on the state. What this allows is any combination of individuals to form private conspiracies to loot the public purse and the taxpayer for welfare services. This is why the state, the manifesto, the Same-Sex Marriage Manifesto, demands that government recognition of the children of same-sex couples, of all these different configurations, because children provide the emotional leverage, or if you like, the emotional blackmail, to rationalize government benefits. So effectively what you have in the long run is the enslavement. 2-parent families, sexually responsible people, will be enslaved to dysfunctional families who will subsist on the welfare services, okay? The model for this slavery, if you like, this enslavement of the productive and sexually responsible to the unproductive and unsexually responsible, is of course the child support system, which is already if you look at the United States and Canada, and increasingly the United Kingdom, the child support system is basically a way of shaking down fathers whose children have been taken away from them. Conservative groups raise the specter, of course, of two homosexuals raising children. This is not necessarily the most likely configuration. What's probably more likely is that single parents, especially single mothers, will marry one another because they can gain parental rights over one another's children and marginalize the father completely and collect government benefits. You see, the National Organization for Women in the United States has pushed same-sex marriage to establish the norm of two-parent female households. But you don't have to be a lesbian. Two single mothers don't have to be lesbians to marry one another. They can marry one another, increase their parental rights, and increase their government benefits and other tax-free income streams. This, according to David Usher of the Center for Marriage Policy in America, this is a significant advantage, compelling women who would otherwise marry single mothers to choose to marry a woman instead of marrying a man. Okay? I can elaborate on this. This also shows why the state, the divorce industry is already looting not only fathers, but the entire wealth of our civilization. If the role of the state is to guarantee the parent-child bond, then that role falls primarily to courts. And who is it that's plundering fathers and other parents in the divorce courts now? It's the courts. Who is it that's forcing the legalization of same-sex marriage all over the Western world? It's the courts. The courts have become instruments of plunder under the rationalization of no-fault justice, which in many ways is a contradiction in terms. I go into the politics of all of this. It's very striking, the politics of this. The Obama administration has basically turned the welfare system in the United States into a giant patronage machine, the way Chicago politics has worked for generations. I think Mrs. Clinton will do the same. It's part of her constituency. If you look here in Europe, The parties that call themselves socialist and communist, increasingly they are part of the same constituency. Their constituency are functionaries of the welfare state. Okay, so this is the rule of the functionaries that we are facing all over the Western world. And again, this is a warning about Poland. Okay. Of course, the financial crisis of 2008 is also attributable to the welfare state. So what is the solution? Okay, I can tell you, I think, first of all, what doesn't work. I don't think, it's actually, the solution is actually relatively simple to all this. I don't think, I'm very skeptical, I know many of you are in favor of this, that you can simply create statutes or constitutional amendments or referenda saying, thou shalt not have same-sex marriage. But as Robert Seidenberg has written in the Washington Times, all a judge has to do is redefine the word man, woman, marriage, relationship, between. You could just redefine these words and these things can be tossed out the window. What's going to do it? I would say 3 points. 1, marriage must be a legally enforceable contract. You cannot have no-fault justice. No-fault justice is a contradiction in terms. It is wreaking havoc not only with our families and our society, it is debasing our legal system into legal nihilism. And it's poisoning the entire judiciary of the Western world, and even, as you're seeing here in Poland, what's going on with the judiciary. So marriage must be a legally enforceable contract. Yes, it's a covenant before God, but it's, at a minimum, it has to be a legally enforceable contract with the state. Secondly, the parent-child bond must be sacrosanct. Parents, mothers, fathers, I don't care, intact families, divorced parents, the bond between parents and their children must be sacrosanct. You cannot have situations like in Norway, where the Badnariu case, where social workers can simply walk into your home and take your children away because they don't like the way you're raising them. I don't care if it's married parents or intact parents. The parent-child bond must carry a heavy burden of proof before courts or social workers or lawyers can take away your children. And thirdly, we need to examine, this is going to be the most controversial of all, but I think we need to look at it at least. We have to start looking at certain aspects of the welfare state for the way that they militate against marriage and in which they break up and drive wedges between mothers and fathers, men and women on the one hand, and between parents and children on the other, both horizontally and vertically. That's a big discussion, but it's the discussion we're not having, it's the discussion we need to have. And it's the discussion you need to have here in Poland, because in many ways this is the last bastion. Thank you very much.